Civilization is often said to have begun with the tablets of Moses, with Yahweh carving commandments into stone. But what if the first laws, the earliest codes of justice, were not whispered on a mountain in the desert, but shaped thousands of years earlier on the banks of the Nile, in the temples of Nubia, Kush, and Kemet? What if African gods themselves gave humanity its first vision of order, balance, and law? Long before the Bible was written, people lived under divine principles that governed not just worship, but society. These were not abstract ideals handed down by faceless kings. They were living truths personified in gods who represented justice, truth, and cosmic order. The most important among them was Ma'at, the goddess of balance and truth. She was not only a deity but the embodiment of law itself. To follow Ma'at was to live in harmony with nature, with community, with one's own conscience. Pharaohs swore to uphold her. Judges measured their verdicts against her feather. Even ordinary people lived by her principle. Do not steal, do not lie, do not abuse the weak. Honor your ancestors, live with dignity. These were laws older than Moses. The gods of Africa shaped human behavior not through fear of punishment, but through integration with the universe. Osiris taught that justice was eternal, binding even the dead in judgment after life. Ptah revealed the creative power of the word, reminding people that speech itself carried moral weight. Isis taught compassion and protection, embedding mercy into the very foundation of law. And Anubis, who guided souls through judgment, reinforced the truth that actions had consequences that stretched beyond this life. This system of divine law was astonishingly advanced. In Kemet, scribes recorded codes of conduct, while priests taught that morality was woven into the fabric of existence itself. Unlike the later image of a jealous god demanding obedience, the African gods taught that law was balance, not domination. It was not a chain, but a rhythm, a way to live in harmony with the cosmos. Archaeological records confirm this. Papyrus texts from Egypt list declarations of innocence, 42 principles of Ma'at recited by the dead as proof of a righteous life. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not oppressed the poor, I have not polluted the waters. These were not commandments shouted from thunderclouds. They were affirmations of harmony, spoken by the people themselves. A legal system rooted in personal integrity and communal balance. And yet, this history was buried. When later religions rose, they claimed the monopoly on morality, declaring that law began with their God alone. The tablets of Moses overshadowed the papyrus of Ma'at. The feather of truth was hidden beneath the stone commandments. The wisdom of Isis and Osiris was reduced to myth, while Yahweh's word was proclaimed as the only law. But the truth lingers. Long before the Bible, long before Yahweh's covenant, African gods created a framework for justice and order that still resonates today. Their laws were not written to control, they were given to sustain. And in their principles, we find the earliest heartbeat of civilization itself. And if these gods gave the first laws, then the kingdoms that honored them became the first classrooms of justice, teaching humanity how to live together under divine order. If the African gods gave humanity its first vision of law, then the kingdoms that honored them became the earliest courts of justice. Nubia, Kush, and Kemet were not simply political states. They were sacred societies where law, governance, and divinity were inseparable. These civilizations thrived because they did not view law as an invention of man, but as a reflection of the gods' order. In Nubia, one of the oldest centers of African civilization, rulers were chosen not only for their strength, but for their ability to embody divine principles. Kings and queens, known as Kandakes, governed with the understanding that they were earthly reflections of the gods. Justice was measured not by conquest alone, but by the maintenance of harmony within their lands. The river, the soil, and the people were treated as sacred trusts. A king who ruled unjustly was seen as failing the gods themselves. The kingdom of Kush, further south along the Nile, carried this vision forward with even greater force. Kushite pharaohs, who later ruled over Egypt itself, claimed legitimacy by invoking Ma'at. Their monuments and inscriptions testify that they saw law not as the command of kings, but as a cosmic rhythm they were bound to uphold. In Kush, laws against theft, exploitation, and dishonesty were not simply social agreements. They were sacred decrees woven into the soul of society. But it was in Kemet, ancient Egypt, that divine law reached its highest articulation. Every pharaoh swore to uphold Ma'at, the balance of the cosmos. The entire state was structured around this principle. The Nile's flooding was measured and celebrated as divine balance. Judges, known as priests of Ma'at, rendered verdicts with her feather carved above their seats. Farmers swore oaths of honesty when declaring their harvests. Merchants invoked Ma'at when weighing goods. Even the smallest act of trade or justice was tied to cosmic law. Law was not separate from religion or philosophy. It was their very expression, and it extended beyond human life. The dead were judged by Anubis in the Hall of Two Truths, where their hearts were weighed against Ma'at's feather. The same principles that governed earthly courts governed eternal destiny. This continuity gave people a deep sense of accountability, not only to rulers but to the gods themselves. What made these kingdoms unique was their refusal to separate the sacred from the civic. To live justly was to live religiously. To lie, cheat, or exploit was not only a crime against neighbor but a disruption of the cosmos. This worldview created stability, for law was not based on fear of kings, but on reverence for divine order. Centuries later, the Bible would tell of commandments carved in stone, delivered with fire and thunder to a trembling people. But in Nubia, Kush, and Kemet, law was already a way of life sung in hymns, carved in tombs, taught in proverbs, lived in daily acts of justice. These kingdoms did not wait for Moses to descend a mountain. They already walked in balance with gods who taught them harmony and truth. And if kingdoms rose on these principles, then their myths and rituals carried the deeper meanings of law stories that revealed not only how to live, but why the cosmos demanded justice in the first place. Law in Africa was never just about rules written on papyrus or recited in courts. It was alive in myth. Stories of the gods were not entertainment alone. They were sacred blueprints that taught people how to live, how to govern, and how to seek justice. To forget the myth was to forget the law, for the two were bound together like breath and body. The most enduring myth was that of Osiris and Isis. Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, was resurrected by the devotion of Isis. His story was not simply about death and rebirth, it was about justice itself. Set represented chaos, greed, and betrayal. Osiris embodied order, fairness, and continuity. When Isis resurrected him, she restored cosmic balance, proving that love and justice conquer corruption. In courts of law, Osiris's myth became a template. Those who disrupted harmony faced consequences, while those who upheld truth were honored. Alongside Osiris stood Ma'at, whose myth was less dramatic but no less vital. She was the goddess who weighed every soul against her feather of truth. This was not a ritual reserved only for the dead. It was a constant reminder that every action carried weight. To cheat a neighbor, to exploit the poor, to pollute the waters, all these tipped the scales against balance. Myths of Ma'at made people see law as eternal, extending beyond kings and even beyond life. The heart would be judged, and no bribe or excuse could save it. Ptah, the craftsman god, carried another kind of law. His myth declared that creation itself was spoken into being through thought and word. To lie, then, was not just immoral, it was destructive, for words shaped reality. Truthful speech was law because it aligned with creation. Falsehood was chaos because it tore at the fabric of the world. Courts in Kemet treated oaths with gravity because Ptah's myth taught that speech itself carried divine power. And then there was Isis, not only mother and healer, but the embodiment of compassion woven into law. Her myth showed that mercy and protection were not optional virtues but sacred duties. She shielded Horus. She healed Osiris. She guided the lost. Through her, law was not only about punishment but about care, about defending the vulnerable and mending what was broken. Even Anubis, with his jackal's head, was a teacher of law. As guardian of the dead, he reminded the living that all accounts must one day be settled. Every burial rite echoed his myth, ensuring that society remembered. Injustice would not be forgotten, even if it escaped human eyes. These myths made law unforgettable. They were retold in festivals, painted on temple walls, carved into tombs, recited in rituals. Every person knew them, not as distant legends but as mirrors of daily life. When a farmer weighed his grain honestly, he honored Ma'at. When a mother protected her child, she embodied Isis. When a judge demanded truth, he invoked Ptah. Myth and law were indistinguishable. Centuries later, the Bible would present commandments as abrupt decrees: do not lie, do not steal, do not kill. But in Africa, these truths were already embedded in story, giving them life and meaning. The people did not simply obey, they understood. They lived inside a world where gods had already written law into the fabric of existence. And if myths gave laws their soul, then images gave those myths their face. For to see the gods was to see law itself made flesh, carved into forms that declared divinity was not distant, but present in the people's own likeness. In Nubia, Kush, and Kemet, the law was not abstract, hidden in scrolls or locked away in the hands of priests. It was visible, embodied in the very faces of the gods. To look upon a statue of Osiris, to gaze at the painted form of Ma'at, was to see the law alive. These images were not decorations, they were declarations that justice had a form, a presence, and a face that reflected the people themselves. Osiris was often shown with dark or green skin. The green spoke of fertility, the renewal of the Nile, the eternal cycle of life and death. But the black skin carved into statues was equally significant. It declared that divinity looked like the soil, like the people, like Africa itself. To see Osiris enthroned was to see justice enthroned, rooted in the earth that fed them all. His crook and flail were not symbols of domination, but of balanced rule, authority tempered with responsibility. Ma'at appeared with her feather, light and unyielding, resting above her head. Artists depicted her with distinctly African features, her dark complexion and braided hair leaving no question. Truth and balance wore the face of her people. When judges sat in court, images of Ma'at presided above them, a reminder that justice was not invented by men but inherited from the divine. The people did not serve the rulers served Ma'at. Isis was shown as a regal black woman crowned with a throne or spread with wings. In her face, law was not cold decree but compassion. Her image reminded communities that justice must protect, that laws are broken if they fail the vulnerable. Her statues in temples were not idols but embodiments of mercy. To look at Isis was to understand that the law without love is no law at all. Even Anubis, painted with the body of a man and the head of a jackal, reinforced law through imagery. His dark figure guided souls into judgment, and in every depiction he stood beside scales, weighing hearts against Ma'at's feather. The message was clear: nothing escapes the law of truth. Not wealth, not power, not deceit. The gods themselves made justice visible, but these images carried another power. They told every farmer, every mother, every child that the gods looked like them. Their features were African because divinity was not foreign. Law was not imported. It was theirs. To see a god with black skin was to know that justice was written not in the sky alone, but in the reflection of their own people. This truth became dangerous when empire rose. Later conquerors knew that as long as people saw themselves in their gods, they could not be enslaved in spirit. And so the chisels of empire struck not only statues but identities. Osiris was whitened in later depictions. Isis was rebranded as Mary, stripped of her wings, Her black features softened into European ideals. Ma'at disappeared entirely, her feather of truth buried in silence. The faces of law were stolen, repainted, and recast until the divine no longer resembled the people. Yet the original images remain, carved in stone that empire could not erase. Tombs still reveal Osiris with black skin, Isis with African beauty, Ma'at in regal poise. These are not inventions of modern imagination, but evidence etched into history. The law was not born in whitewashed tablets. It was born in the faces of black gods, carved into eternity. And if the gods' images proclaimed the first laws, then their names carried those laws even further, for to speak a god's name was to invoke the power of justice itself. If images gave the gods faces, names gave them breath. To speak a name was to invoke presence, to awaken the principle it carried. In Africa's earliest civilizations, the names of the gods were not casual identifiers, they were the very syllables of law, binding people to truth, justice, and balance. To forget the name was to lose the law itself. The name Ma'at was more than a goddess's title. It meant truth, balance, and harmony. When a judge invoked Ma'at, he was not only asking for divine favor, he was binding his verdict to the very order of the universe. To say Ma'at was to summon a principle that transcended personal interest, reminding rulers and commoners alike that no one could escape truth. The name itself was law. The name, Osiris, Ausar, carried the weight of justice beyond death. To whisper his name in funerary rites was to acknowledge that actions in life would be measured eternally. His story as a god who ruled the underworld ensured that no crime went unpunished, no virtue unrewarded. In every prayer to Osiris, people affirmed a legal system larger than any king's decree. The name Isis, Osid, signified healing, mercy, and protection. To call upon her was to affirm that law was not only about judgment but about compassion. Communities that honored Isis remembered that true justice cares for the weak and restores the broken. Her name shaped how law was practiced, not as rigid punishment, but as balance infused with mercy. Ptah, whose very name meant the opener, reminded people that words themselves were acts of creation. His name invoked the truth that law begins in speech. Contracts, oaths, declarations all carried divine weight, because Ptah's myth taught that to speak falsely was to tear at creation itself. In every court, the spoken word was sacred because Ptah's name demanded it. And Anubis, Anpu, guardian of the scales, carried the authority of judgment. His name was a warning and a comfort. Justice sees all. To call Anubis was to declare that every act would one day be weighed, that no power could escape accountability. His name was both deterrent and reassurance, ensuring people lived with integrity. These names were more than myth, they were daily anchors. Farmers swore by Ma'at when measuring grain. Merchants invoked Ptah when sealing trade. Families prayed to Isis for protection, warriors to Shango for strength, sailors to Yamaya for safe passage. Law was not a book of decrees, but a living vocabulary. Empire understood this power. That is why it attacked the names. The Bible refers vaguely to idols and false gods, rarely naming them, for names give power. Asherah, once honored alongside Yahweh, was stripped from scripture. Osiris, Isis, and Ma'at were dismissed as pagan inventions. Orishas were demonized, their names whispered only in fear. By erasing the names, empire hoped to erase the laws they embodied. But the names did not die. They lived in folk tales, in proverbs, in songs disguised as hymns. They crossed oceans with the enslaved, hidden under Catholic saints in Santeria, remembered in the chants of Vodun, carried in the festivals of Candomblé. Every time a grandmother whispered an Orisha's name, every time a priest poured libations to Osiris or Ma'at, the law lived on. For names cannot be destroyed. They are seeds buried in memory, waiting for the right moment to bloom. And when they rise, They bring back not only the gods, but the order they once gave, a reminder that law did not begin with empire, but with Africa's gods, whose names still echo through time. And if names carried law in spoken form, then stories carved into scripture would carry them even further. Stories later stolen, reshaped, and claimed as new revelations. Names anchored the gods' laws, but stories carried them across generations. And it is here in the myths retold as scripture that we see the clearest evidence of erasure and appropriation. For the Bible did not arrive in a vacuum. Its narratives of creation, justice, and resurrection echo stories already ancient in Africa, shaped by gods whose principles governed long before Yahweh was named. Consider creation itself. The Gospel of John opens with the words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." This profound statement is often treated as unique revelation, but the principle belongs to Ptah, the Memphite creator god. Long before John wrote, priests in Memphis taught that Ptah conceived the world in thought and spoke it into being. Creation by word, creation by breath, this was African law. Truth spoken builds, lies destroy. John's gospel preserved the principle but erased Ptah's name. Resurrection, the heart of Christianity, had already been written into African law through Osiris. Betrayed and slain by Set, Osiris was resurrected by Isis, becoming judge of the dead and proof that life continued beyond death. For centuries, Egyptians swore their lives were measured against Osiris's law. Live justly, and death is not the end. The story of Christ rising on the third day carried this same hope, yet the name of Osiris was omitted, his law reduced to myth so that another could claim uniqueness. Final judgment, so vividly described in Revelation, was already the domain of Ma'at. In the hall of two truths, every soul's heart was weighed against her feather. No rank, wealth, or power could outweigh truth. This was not metaphor, it was law, practiced daily and projected into eternity. Revelation borrowed the imagery. Books opened, souls judged, eternity decided. But where Ma'at had ruled impartially, the biblical version turned the scene into obedience to one jealous God. The principle of justice remained. The goddess vanished. Even mercy and compassion were recast. Isis, the great healer and mother, embodied a law of care that the vulnerable must be protected, that love restores what law alone cannot. Her image, cradling Horus, became the template for Mary holding Jesus. Her role as divine mother reduced and reshaped. The mercy she personified was too powerful to erase, so empire adopted it, stripped it of her name, and claimed it as their own. Across every story, the pattern is the same. Law and myth were not destroyed but stolen, retold under new names to create the illusion that morality began with Yahweh. But the echoes cannot be silenced. Archaeology reveals it. Inscriptions on temple walls tell the same truths the Bible later claimed. Do not steal, do not kill, speak truth, honor the gods, respect the weak. These were not first carved in Hebrew but lived in Africa for millennia. Why steal instead of invent anew? Because the people already knew these laws. They already lived them. To erase them completely would have sparked rebellion. But to rebrand them, to cloak them in the authority of a new god, ensured continuity while transferring loyalty. The people obeyed the same principles, but the credit shifted to empire's deity, and so the Bible became less revelation and more reconfiguration, a rewriting of African truths. The laws of Ptah, Osiris, Ma'at, and Isis lived on, but their names were silenced, their origins denied. Yet the laws did not only survive in stories, they also endured in ritual, in the sacred practices that brought justice, mercy, and truth into daily life. Practices empire could not erase, but only disguise. Stories carried law in memory, but rituals carried it in flesh. The people of Nubia, Kush, and Kemet did not merely tell of Ma'at, Osiris, or Isis. They enacted their truths in ceremonies that bound community and cosmos together. These rituals were the living courts of divine order. And when empire rose, It did not abolish them outright. It transformed them, disguising the sacred practices of African gods as Christian sacraments, stripping their names but not their essence. Consider the ritual of libation. For millennia, Africans poured water or wine to the earth, offering thanks to ancestors, gods, and the cycles of life. This act, simple yet profound, affirmed that justice included honoring those who came before. When the Church absorbed this ritual, it became the Eucharistic wine, no longer an offering to Osiris or to the spirits of the Nile, but proclaimed as the blood of Christ. The gesture remained, the meaning was rebranded, or the sacred meal. In Kemet, offerings of bread, beer, and grain were shared with gods and community alike, affirming balance between divine and human. In Christianity, the same ritual appears as communion bread and wine blessed, shared as a holy meal. Yet its origin lay not in Jerusalem, but on the banks of the Nile, where Ptah's word sanctified food and Ma'at's principle ensured fairness in its sharing. The ritual of purification also endured. Africans bathed in sacred rivers, cleansed with herbs, or anointed themselves before ceremonies, aligning body and spirit with truth. The Church transformed this into baptism immersion in water, now declared in the name of Yahweh or Christ. But beneath the new words remained the same rhythm. To wash was to enter divine order, to emerge cleansed of imbalance. Even the ritual of judgment found new life. Egyptians believed the dead recited the negative confessions, affirmations of innocence before Ma'at. This ritualized law was profound. Every soul testified, "I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not oppressed the poor." When Christianity spoke of final judgment, of confession and absolution, it was echoing the same practice. The ritual of declaring one's truth to the divine was too deeply ingrained to erase. Music and dance, too, carried law. The drumbeat that called to the Orishas and to Hathor was banned by colonizers, declared sinful, yet its pulse slipped into hymns, chants, and organ chords. What was once a dance in honor of Oshun or Isis became a procession, bodies still moving, though stripped of their original names. The rhythm of justice survived, hidden in plain sound. Why disguise these rituals rather than destroy them? Because rituals are embodied memory. A people can be forced to forget words, but their bodies still remember the gesture of pouring, the rhythm of clapping, the power of cleansing water, the sanctity of shared meals. Empire knew it was easier to rename than to abolish. Thus, Christian sacraments are less inventions than inheritances. They are African rituals repackaged under a new god, evidence that law did not originate with Yahweh, but with gods who ruled the Nile, the rivers, the earth. And yet, behind every disguised ritual was a philosophy deeper still, the worldview of balance and truth that gave law its very meaning. Empire tried to silence it, but the wisdom of the gods still breathes through every principle of justice we know today. Rituals gave rhythm to daily life, but philosophy gave them direction. In the kingdoms of Nubia, Kush, and Kemet, law was not just a set of rules or ceremonies. It was a worldview, a way of understanding the cosmos itself. This philosophy, embodied in the gods, taught that justice was not imposed by fear, but sustained by balance. It was a system designed not to dominate, but to harmonize, and it guided humanity long before empires reshaped it into obedience. At the heart of this philosophy stood Ma'at. She was more than a goddess. She was the very principle of existence, the law by which the sun rose, the Nile flowed, and hearts were judged. To live by Ma'at was to live in alignment with creation. Her philosophy declared that truth, justice, and harmony were inseparable. Lies, greed, and oppression were not just crimes, they were disruptions of the cosmic order. This made law not a matter of avoiding punishment, but of protecting the balance that sustained all life. Osiris carried the philosophy of continuity. His myth showed that life and death were not opposites but parts of a cycle. Justice did not end at the grave, it extended beyond, ensuring that even rulers would face accountability. This philosophy shaped governance, for a pharaoh who oppressed his people knew he would one day stand before Osiris. The idea that no one was above justice gave African law a moral depth unmatched by empires that ruled only through fear. Isis embodied compassion as law. Her philosophy declared that mercy was not weakness but strength, that healing was as sacred as judgment. To honor Isis was to build communities where the vulnerable were protected, where mothers, children, and the sick were not left behind. Her presence in law reminded people that justice without love is tyranny, but love without justice is powerless. Ptah revealed another layer of philosophy, the creative power of the word. His myth taught that speech shapes reality. To speak truth was to align with creation, while falsehoods invited chaos. This philosophy made contracts, oaths, and declarations sacred acts. In Kemet, lying under oath was not only illegal, it was an assault on the structure of existence. Through Ptah, philosophy and law fused in the recognition that words carry power. Even Anubis, silent guide of souls, contributed philosophy. He taught that every action, no matter how small, left weight upon the heart. This was not abstract morality, but a lived awareness. Everything mattered. A kind gesture lightened the soul. A cruel deed burdened it. The philosophy was clear. Law was not external. It lived within every heart, to be weighed against truth in the end. Empire would later bury this philosophy beneath fear. Where Ma'at taught balance, Yahweh demanded obedience. Where Isis embodied compassion, empire exalted punishment. Where Ptah sanctified speech, scripture threatened curses. Law became less about harmony and more about control. Yet even in distortion, the old philosophy survived. The scales of justice carved into courtrooms echo Ma'at. The resurrection promised in scripture echoes Osiris. The sanctity of oaths echoes Ptah. These are remnants of a philosophy empire tried to erase but could never fully destroy. And if philosophy gave law its depth, then resistance gave it its endurance. For when empire twisted justice into fear, the gods became not only teachers but allies of rebellion, fueling a spirit that law must serve freedom, not oppression. Philosophy gave the African gods depth, but resistance gave them power that empire could never crush. When foreign invaders sought to twist law into chains of obedience, the gods became something more than figures of worship. They became rallying cries, protectors of the oppressed, and symbols of rebellion. In their myths and rituals, people found courage to defy rulers who claimed authority but denied justice. Osiris was the god who proved that death is not defeat. To oppressed people, his story carried a message sharper than any sword. Even if empire kills the body, the soul rises, and truth cannot be buried. Slaves in Nubia whispered his name as assurance that injustice would not last forever. To fight and die for truth was not the end, but a passage into Osiris's domain, where justice still reigned. Isis became the protector of the vulnerable. Her story of piecing Osiris back together taught that even shattered lives could be healed. For mothers who had lost children to war or enslavement, Isis was a reminder that love is a weapon as powerful as law. In her name, women passed down songs, chants, and hidden rituals that preserved the memory of balance, ensuring that the flame of justice never went out. Ma'at stood as the ultimate challenge to corruption. Pharaohs and judges who strayed from her principles could not escape her feather, which weighed every heart. Even under oppressive rulers, people held fast to the belief that balance would return. This conviction gave them strength to endure. To trust Ma'at was to know that empire's power was temporary, truth would eventually outweigh lies. Resistance also lived in the Orishas of West Africa. Shango, god of thunder, was invoked in uprisings, his storms seen as signs of divine rage against injustice. Ogun, lord of iron, became patron of rebellion, his tools of labor refashioned into weapons. Oshun, goddess of sweetness and fertility, reminded the people that joy itself was defiance, that to sing, to dance, to love, was to resist dehumanization. These gods gave courage, transforming ordinary survival into sacred rebellion. When empire expanded into the Americas, dragging millions into bondage, these gods crossed the ocean with their people. They were hidden in songs sung in the fields, encoded in dances, disguised under Catholic saints. Yet they remained alive, whispering strength to the enslaved. In Haiti, Vodun ceremonies invoked the law, summoning ancestral spirits that inspired the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave uprising in history. Drums thundered with Shango's voice, warriors marched with Ogun's strength, mothers prayed with Oshun's sweetness. The gods walked into battle beside their people. Empire feared this resistance. Drums were banned, rituals outlawed, names demonized. But fear itself proved the truth. The gods were not powerless myths, but forces of liberation. They could not be destroyed because they lived in the hearts of the people, woven into memory, blood, and soil. And so the gods became more than guardians of law. They became protectors of freedom. They taught that any law divorced from truth, compassion, and balance was no law at all. Resistance was not rebellion against order, it was loyalty to the higher order the gods had already given. And if the gods could inspire defiance in the darkest of times, then their survival depended on secrecy, hidden rituals, coded songs, and disguised altars that carried their memory through centuries of silence. When empire outlawed the old gods, they did not disappear. They retreated into shadows, into whispers, into secret places where memory could still breathe. Across Africa and the diaspora, people built hidden altars, sometimes carved in stone, sometimes disguised in ritual, sometimes carried in the body itself. These altars preserved the law of the gods when open worship meant punishment or death. In Kemet and Kush, altars were concealed in homes, tucked into walls, or disguised within shrines that outwardly appeared acceptable to conquerors. A feather etched onto pottery was not decoration but devotion to Ma'at. A figure of a mother holding a child echoed Isis even if named otherwise. People learned to encode their gods into symbols that seemed ordinary but carried eternal meaning. Across the Atlantic, in the Americas, the enslaved carried the gods within their songs and ceremonies. In Cuba, the Orishas were cloaked in Catholic saints. Shango in Saint Barbara, Oshun in Our Lady of Charity, Ogun in Saint George. In Brazil, candomblé worshippers gathered in hidden houses, outwardly celebrating Christian festivals while secretly invoking the Orishas. In Haiti, Vodun priests invoked the LWA under the guise of Catholic prayers, their drums beating rhythms empire thought suppressed. The hidden altars were not always physical. They lived in the body. Drums were banned on plantations because their rhythms carried rebellion. But the people transformed their bodies into instruments, clapping, stomping, chanting. Every rhythm was an offering. Every step of a dance, though disguised as play, was a prayer to Oshun, Yemaya, or Shango. The body itself became a living temple when wood and stone were forbidden. Even in death, the gods remained. Funerals, outwardly Christian, still poured libations to ancestors. Graves were marked with symbols that echoed Osiris and Anubis. Prayers recited for the dead often carried coded affirmations of the negative confessions. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not oppressed the poor. Though names were hidden, the law of Ma'at survived in whispers at the graveside. Why did these hidden altars matter? Because they kept the memory alive. Without them, the gods might have been lost entirely, erased from history. But each disguised offering, each coded hymn, each hidden symbol was a seed planted in time. They bridged generations, ensuring that children born under empire's chains could still inherit fragments of ancestral truth, and these fragments were powerful. They inspired resilience, unity, and resistance. They whispered that identity was not erased, that dignity was not destroyed, that the gods still watched and waited. Hidden altars preserved not only ritual but spirit. They proved that law, once given by the gods, could not be erased by decree, whip, or chain. And when the time was right, these seeds planted in shadow began to sprout. The hidden altars became open festivals again. The whispers became chants. The symbols carved in secret became banners of pride. The gods, once concealed, began their return, not as faint memories, but as living presences rising from the underground to reclaim their place in the light. For centuries, the gods lived behind veils. They survived in coded songs, in hidden altars, in the disguised faces of saints. But veils are never permanent. Slowly, quietly at first, the masks began to slip. The gods who once governed law and order in Africa re-emerged, their presence no longer confined to whispers. Their names, once forbidden, began to be spoken aloud again. Their images, once destroyed, began to be painted with pride. The unmasking had begun. In Brazil, millions gather each year on the beaches to honor Yamaya, mother of oceans. White-clad devotees cast flowers into the waves, their prayers echoing traditions empire tried to erase. What was once a hidden act is now a national festival, unashamed and unstoppable. The law of the goddess to honor the waters that sustain life has returned to the surface. In Cuba, practitioners of Santeria openly call upon Shango, Ogun, and Oshun, their drums no longer silenced, their chants no longer disguised. Once cloaked under the names of saints, the Orishas stand in their own right. Their laws of balance, strength, and sweetness shape communities that survived centuries of erasure. In Haiti, Vodun is recognized as a religion of resilience. Its priests and priestesses lead ceremonies where the LWA speak through possession, guiding their people with ancestral wisdom. Drums that once sparked fear in the ears of slave masters now echo as symbols of freedom. The gods are no longer in hiding. They stand as pillars of cultural pride. And in Africa itself, the reclamation is even more profound. In Nigeria, Yoruba cosmology flourishes, with Orisha worship restored to its central place in spiritual life. In Egypt, seekers study the wisdom of Ma'at, Osiris, and Isis, reclaiming truths long buried under foreign narratives. Across the continent, rituals outlawed by colonial rule are practiced again, not as relics but as living systems of law and balance. Even in the West, where erasure worked hardest, the gods are returning. Scholars trace the origins of biblical commandments back to Ma'at's principles. Artists paint Osiris with black skin, Isis with African features, Ma'at with her feather of truth. Activists and thinkers reclaim these gods as symbols of justice, reminding the world that morality was not born in the deserts of Sinai but on the fertile soil of Africa. The unmasking terrifies institutions, for if Osiris already ruled resurrection, then Christ is not unique. If Ma'at already weighed hearts, then judgment did not begin with Yahweh. If Isis already embodied divine motherhood, then Mary is not alone. To recognize these truths is to unravel centuries of control, to admit that empire's faith was built on borrowed foundations. Yet the return of the gods is not about conquest or replacement. It is about restoration. It is about remembering that law is not meant to enslave but to harmonize, that justice is not meant to instill fear but to sustain life. The gods return not to dominate but to remind, not to erase but to heal. Once unmasked, they cannot be unseen. They rise again in festivals, in temples, in chants, in classrooms, in the art and memory of people across the world. The gods step into the open, carrying with them the laws they gave millennia ago, laws that still speak of truth, balance, and harmony. And as their masks fall, something deeper awakens: the healing of identity, the restoration of dignity, the rediscovery of a truth empire tried to bury but could never destroy. When the gods return, they bring more than names and rituals. They bring healing. For centuries, colonization and church doctrine inflicted a subtle but devastating wound: the erasure of dignity, the teaching that African ancestors were cursed, their gods demonic, their traditions shameful. This wound carved itself into memory, passed down in whispers of inferiority, shaping how generations saw themselves. But memory, once restored, is medicine. To remember the gods is to begin to heal. The healing begins with dignity. To know that Ma'at was the goddess of truth long before commandments were carved is to reclaim pride. It reminds the descendants of Africa that justice, law, and balance were their inheritance, not gifts from foreign gods. To see Osiris again as the ruler of resurrection is to remember that eternal life was promised in Africa first. To honor Isis is to restore the image of the Black Mother as divine, compassionate, and central. Dignity blossoms when the people realize they were never without gods, never without law, never without sacred wisdom. Healing continues with identity. For centuries, Black children grew up in churches staring at images of a white God, a pale Christ, a European Mary. These images whispered that holiness looked nothing like them. To reclaim Osiris with black skin, to see Isis with African features, to invoke Orishas who speak in the rhythms of their ancestors, this reshapes identity. No longer must the sacred feel foreign. God looks like them. Their hair, their skin, their culture carry the divine reflection. The erasure of identity dissolves when the gods return. But the deepest healing comes in the body and spirit. Where empire taught shame, the gods teach reverence. Sexuality, once called sinful, is revealed as sacred fertility under Oshun. Dance, condemned as lust, becomes prayer under Hathor. Drums, silenced as demonic, become thunder again with Shango. The body, once called corrupt, becomes temple once more. This restores wholeness to people taught for centuries to distrust their own existence. Healing also spreads across communities. Where once neighbors were divided by doctrines that demonized ancestral practice, now they gather in festivals, pour libations together, call the names of their gods openly. Collective wounds mend when collective rituals return. Memory is not just individual, but communal, restoring bonds of belonging that empire fractured. This healing does not erase the scars of conquest, but it reclaims their power. Every ritual performed today, every hymn sung to Orishas, every image of Isis painted anew declares survival. It says, "We were never broken, only hidden. We were never cursed, only silenced." Yet healing does more than mend the past. It prepares the future. For when people remember who they were, they can imagine who they might become. And if dignity and identity are restored, then law itself can be reimagined, not as a tool of fear and control, but as the gods first gave it: balance, harmony, and justice woven into life itself. Among the deepest erasures was the silencing of the divine feminine. In Africa's earliest civilizations, women were not marginal figures in law or ritual, they were central. The gods of justice and creation were not only male, they were balanced by powerful goddesses whose wisdom sustained the first societies. To erase them was to cut out half of truth itself. Their return restores balance, showing that law is not domination but harmony, not fear but nurturing order. Ma'at was the heart of law. She was truth embodied, the principle that weighed every soul, the feather against which kings and commoners alike were judged. Her wisdom declared that no ruler was above balance. Pharaohs swore to uphold her, judges carved her image above their courts, and people lived with her as their moral compass. Without Ma'at, there is no justice. Isis was the healer, the protector, the embodiment of compassion. Her wisdom showed that law must not only punish, but protect. Her myth of restoring Osiris to life carried the lesson that justice heals the broken, lifts the vulnerable, and sustains the community. In her embrace, the law was not cold decree but living mercy. Hathor embodied joy, fertility, and music, her wisdom reminding humanity that justice without joy is incomplete. A society that ignores beauty, pleasure, and creativity cannot call itself whole. Her presence in law was not frivolous, but essential, for she taught that human dignity includes the right to celebrate life. In West Africa, the Orishas preserved this same balance. Oshun ruled rivers and sweetness, her wisdom affirming that law must flow with kindness and fertility. Yemaya, mother of oceans, taught that justice must nurture, for every child, every wave, every life is born from her. These mothers of creation govern not through force, but through sustenance, reminding humanity that order comes not from fear, but from care. Empire feared these truths. To impose patriarchal control, the sacred feminine had to be erased. Ma'at disappeared from scripture. Isis was disguised as Mary, stripped of her wings and her authority. Oshun and Yemaya were demonized. Their waters declared the dwelling place of spirits to be feared. Women themselves were diminished, their roles in law, healing, and leadership silenced. With the goddesses buried, law was rewritten as domination, rigid, hierarchical, stripped of compassion, but memory cannot be killed. The divine mothers survived in fragments in the Virgin Mary holding her child with Isis's grace, in folk songs praising rivers that still flowed with Oshun's sweetness, in scales of justice carved into courts that still echoed Ma'at. Their wisdom never vanished, it waited. Now, as their names rise again, they restore what was stolen. They remind us that true law must be balanced, truth with mercy, justice with compassion, order with joy. They challenge patriarchal systems that reduced law to punishment and demand a return to harmony. Their wisdom insists that without the feminine, justice is incomplete. And as the mothers rise, their wisdom unmasks how empire twisted sacred life into sin, turning joy into temptation, sexuality into shame, and compassion into weakness, all to control what the goddesses had once declared holy. Before empire seized power, life itself was law. Planting crops was honoring Osiris. Dancing was prayer to Hathor. Lovemaking was communion with Oshun. The body was not corrupt, it was temple. The rivers were not ordinary, they were mothers. Every act of living was sacred. Law was harmony between body, earth, and cosmos. But when conquerors rose, they found that such freedom made control impossible. So they redefined the sacred, turning joy into sin, balance into obedience, and humanity itself into shame. The body was the first target. In Kemet, Ma'at taught that the body was part of divine balance. To nourish it, to honor it, was law. Isis herself revealed the holiness of motherhood, and Hathor sanctified pleasure as a gift. But empire twisted this. Desire was declared temptation, sexuality condemned as sinful. Women, once revered as embodiments of divine power, were reduced to silent vessels. Men, once honored for strength and fertility, were taught to distrust their own impulses. The body, once sacred, became a battlefield of guilt. Nature followed. Where Oshun's rivers and Yemaya's oceans were worshipped as mothers, empire stripped them of divinity, declaring them mere resources to exploit. Ritual baths and libations became witchcraft. Festivals of fertility were outlawed. The drumbeat was silenced as the devil's sound. By declaring nature profane, empire severed the bond between people and the earth, breaking a law older than scripture. Even joy was corrupted. In Africa, dance was prayer, song was invocation, rhythm was justice embodied. To laugh, to feast, to celebrate life was to honor Hathor's law of beauty and balance. But empire declared joy frivolous, even dangerous. Festivals were policed, dances banned, music censored. People were taught that holiness meant silence, suffering, and restraint. Joy, once sacred, was rebranded as sin. This twisting of the sacred served a purpose: control. A people who feared their own bodies, distrusted their desires, and silenced their joy were easier to govern. Law was no longer about balance but obedience, no longer about harmony but hierarchy. Where Ma'at weighed the heart, Yahweh demanded submission. Where Isis healed, empire punished. Where Hathor celebrated, empire condemned. The consequences were devastating. Generations grew up ashamed of their own skin, suspicious of their own joy, disconnected from the earth that sustained them. Law became chains instead of wings. People obeyed, but they no longer lived in balance. Yet even under repression, the old ways endured. Hidden dances carried Oshun's sweetness. Secret drum beats invoked Shango's thunder. Lovers whispered Isis's name in forbidden prayers. The sacred could be silenced but not destroyed. And here lies the truth empire feared. What it called sin was actually freedom. What it condemned as lust was fertility. What it dismissed as frivolity was joy. What it demonized as witchcraft was law in its purest form, balance with body, nature, and spirit. This corruption of the sacred set the stage for survival in shadows. For if empire could not erase the sacred, it forced it underground, where hidden altars and disguised rituals preserved it until the time of return. When empire declared the sacred to be sin, it forced the old ways underground. Yet law, once given by the gods, could not be destroyed. It retreated into secret places, into hidden altars, disguised practices, and encoded traditions that preserved balance even in the face of oppression. These hidden spaces became the womb of survival, where memory gestated until it was ready to rise again. In Africa, altars were concealed inside ordinary homes. A clay pot of water was not just storage but a shrine to Oshun. A carved feather etched into pottery whispered devotion to Ma'at. A mother's lullaby to her child carried the voice of Isis, even if no one outside the family knew. Law lived quietly in kitchens, fields, and bedrooms, disguised as daily life, yet pulsing with divine rhythm. Among enslaved Africans in the Americas, the altars grew even more disguised. On plantations, Shango was hidden behind St. Barbara, Yemaya behind Our Lady of Regla, Ogun behind St. George. Outwardly, worshippers appeared to honor saints. Inwardly, they invoked gods older than the Bible. Each saint's feast day became a secret festival, a chance to call the Orishas back into the world without attracting empire's wrath. Even the body itself became altar. Drums were outlawed, but rhythm lived on in clapping, stomping, and call-and-response songs. To outsiders, these were harmless hymns. To insiders, they were offerings to the gods, invocations of power disguised as work songs. A stomp in rhythm was a prayer to Shango's thunder. A soft hum at the river's edge was a hymn to Oshun's sweetness. Every body carried the gods within it, every gesture a secret act of law. In funerals, the hidden altars rose strongest. Enslaved Africans poured libations for the dead, even under the guise of Christian burial. Graves were marked with symbols recalling Osiris and Anubis, guardians of judgment. The recitations spoken over the dead echoed the negative confessions. I have not lied. I have not stolen. I have not oppressed the weak. Even under empire's gaze, the laws of Ma'at were still declared. Why were these hidden altars so powerful? Because they preserved more than ritual, they preserved identity. To honor the gods, even in secret, was to declare that erasure had failed. It reminded people that their lives were not defined by chains, their laws not dictated by empire. They were custodians of truths older than conquerors, guardians of balance too eternal to be destroyed. These altars also served as schools of resistance. Children raised around them inherited memory. Songs taught them courage. Stories passed in whispers gave them pride. Even in captivity, they knew they carried divine law within. Empire thought it had converted them, but beneath every disguise, the old gods still ruled. And so, the hidden altars were not merely survival, they were preparation. They kept the fire alive until the day the masks could be removed, until the gods could rise again openly, until law could return to the surface. The gods were never gone. They were only waiting in the shadows, preparing for the moment when their masks would fall and their names would thunder again across the world. For generations, the gods lived behind masks. They survived as saints in churches, as rhythms in work songs, as whispers in family prayers. But no mask lasts forever. Slowly, their names began to slip past lips without fear. Their images returned, no longer disguised but painted, carved, and celebrated in their original glory. The unmasking was not a sudden act but a long unfolding, as if the gods themselves decided the time for silence was over. On the beaches of Brazil, thousands gather each year dressed in white to cast flowers and candles into the sea. What once had to be disguised is now open homage to Yamaya, mother of the oceans. Waves receive the offerings as drums and songs rise into the night. The law she gave that water is life, that all must respect the womb of creation flows again in public celebration. In Cuba, practitioners of Santeria call openly upon Shango, Oshun, and Ogun. Their altars are visible, their drums unapologetic. Once forced to cloak these gods under saints, devotees now name them without disguise. Shango's thunder rolls in his own name. Oshun's sweetness flows freely. Ogun's iron is honored as divine strength. The Orishas no longer hide. They are unmasked. In Haiti, Vodun priests and priestesses lead ceremonies where the Labue speak through possession, guiding communities just as they did in Africa. Drums, once feared as weapons of rebellion, now echo as symbols of resilience and freedom. In every chant, every step of the dance, the gods declare themselves alive and present. In Africa, the revival is even more profound. Yoruba cosmology thrives in Nigeria, where Orisha worship is restored as central to cultural life. In Egypt, seekers reclaim the wisdom of Ma'at, Isis, and Osiris, peeling back layers of colonial distortion to remember their true origins. Across the continent, rituals once banned as pagan are practiced again in daylight. Even in the West, where erasure was most aggressive, the gods are unmasking. Scholars trace biblical commandments to Ma'at's 42 principles. Artists depict Osiris and Isis with unapologetic black features. Activists reclaim Shango and Ogun as symbols of justice and resistance. Social media spreads these truths to millions, making it impossible to contain what empire once buried. The unmasking terrifies institutions. For if Osiris already ruled resurrection, then Christianity's central miracle is not unique. If Ma'at already weighed hearts, then morality was never the sole property of Yahweh. If Isis already embodied divine motherhood, then Mary is not alone. To acknowledge this is to unravel centuries of spiritual monopoly. But the unmasking is not about replacing one god with another. It is about balance restored. It is about remembering that law was never meant to enslave but to harmonize, never meant to condemn but to sustain. The gods step into the open not to dominate but to heal, reminding humanity of the principles buried yet never destroyed. Once unmasked, they cannot be hidden again. They rise in festivals, in classrooms, in temples, in art, in identity. They return as living law, declaring that truth, balance, and harmony were always Africa's first gifts to civilization. And as their faces shine again, they do more than restore memory, they heal the wounds empire left behind, stitching back the dignity and identity that were torn away. When the gods returned from behind their masks, their presence rippled far beyond the temples and festivals where their names were spoken. Their unmasking was not just a religious act, it was a global reckoning. For the return of Africa's gods means the return of truth's empire spent centuries burying. And when those truths rise, they reshape how humanity sees justice, identity, and power itself. In Africa, the revival has sparked cultural pride. Young people learn that Ma'at's 42 principles predated the 10 Commandments, that Osiris's resurrection preceded Christianity, that Isis's divine motherhood is older than Mary. This realization restores dignity stolen by colonial education. Africa is no longer seen as a place waiting for civilization, but as the cradle of civilization itself, the birthplace of divine law. In the diaspora, the return is deeply personal. For descendants of the enslaved who grew up hearing that their ancestors were heathens, this revival heals wounds. To honor Oshun, Ogun, or Yamaya openly is to reclaim the inheritance empire tried to strip away. It restores identity, showing that the songs of survival were not superstition but sacred resilience. It reconnects them with roots deeper than chains, proving they were never cursed, only silenced. In the West, the revival unsettles centuries of theology. Scholars now admit that biblical laws echo older African principles. Artists reclaim the divine image, painting black gods and goddesses with unapologetic beauty. Activists invoke Shango and Ogun as symbols of justice and resistance, tying modern struggles for liberation to ancestral power. What was once erased now fuels movements, demanding a reckoning with the foundations of law, religion, and morality. The return also challenges global systems of control. If law began not with Yahweh but with Ma'at, then empire's monopoly on morality collapses. If resurrection was Osiris's gift before Christ, then Christianity's claim of uniqueness falters. If compassion and healing were Isis's domain long before Mary, then patriarchal theology is exposed as a distortion. Institutions built on exclusivity tremble when plurality is restored. Yet the consequences are not only disruptive, they are healing. Humanity is reminded that divinity is not narrow, not European, not monopolized by one faith. God has many faces, many voices, many names, and Africa's were the first. This realization opens the door to dialogue, to balance, to the possibility of a world where spirituality unites instead of divides. But the greatest consequence is the awakening of memory. Millions across the world now realize that what was called myth was in fact history, that what was called sin was sacred, that what was called pagan was law itself. And when memory awakens, people cannot be controlled in the same way. A people who know their gods cannot be enslaved. A people who remember their roots cannot be erased. A people who see the divine in their own image cannot be shamed. This is the global consequence of revival. Dignity restored, truth revealed, balance remembered. And once memory awakens, it cannot return to sleep. Yet memory is only the beginning. Revival leads to transformation, a collective awakening that reshapes not only how we see the past, but how we choose to live now and in the future. The gods were hidden, their names erased, their faces painted over, their rituals condemned, yet they endured. They whispered in lullabies, pulsed in drums, glowed in hidden altars. They crossed oceans in chains but refused to bow. And now, after centuries of silence, they rise again not as relics of myth, but as living forces shaping a new age. This is the awakening. Awakening begins with truth. To know that Ma'at gave 42 principles of justice before Moses received 10 is to strip away centuries of lies. To know that Osiris rose long before Christ is to realize resurrection is not exclusive, but universal. To know that Isis healed and protected before Mary is to restore the divine feminine to her rightful place. Truth pierces erasure, reminding us that Africa was never waiting for civilization. It was civilization. Awakening deepens with memory. When a young woman pours water to Oshun, she reclaims what her ancestors preserved in secret. When a man drums for Shango, he reconnects with thunder that empire tried to silence. When a child hears that God looks like them, black, beautiful, powerful memory becomes healing. These acts are not nostalgia. They are medicine, stitching together the wounds of erasure and restoring identity long denied. Awakening expands into law reborn. The gods remind us that law was never chains, never obedience enforced by fear. Law was balance. Law was truth. Law was harmony between people, earth, and spirit. To revive Ma'at is to restore justice that protects the weak, To honor Isis is to remember that mercy is as sacred as judgment. To follow Ptah is to treat words as creative power. To call on Ogun is to see labor as holy. Law is not decrees carved in stone, but living principles carried in every action. Awakening culminates in freedom. A people who know their gods cannot be enslaved. A people who see the divine in their own reflection cannot be shamed. A people who dance, sing, and pray in their ancestors' rhythms cannot be silenced. Freedom is not given by empire or scripture. It is born in the recognition that the gods never left, that their power has always lived in us. And so, the awakening spreads in festivals where Yamaya's waves are honored, in classrooms where Ma'at's principles are studied, in movements where Shango's justice thunders, in prayers where Isis's compassion heals. Across continents, across oceans, the black gods rise, and with them, humanity remembers balance. The awakening is not a return to the past. It is a rebirth. It is the realization that the gods who created the first laws before the Bible still speak today in the heartbeat, in the river, in the truth that will not be silenced. The gods are rising.